because when we look at our trading relationship with China, we have two key issues. We have massive market access barriers to exports of goods and services into China. And then we have China's distorted command style economic system where the government pulls every possible lever of the economy, including, raw material, electricity, land, labor, certainly prices, to underprice the United States. And what I found out through my 25 years of experience dealing with trade with China, representing domestic industries, Chinese goods are typically valued at about 60, 70%, in many instances, less than US products. So yeah, I think the president, if he needs to point to numbers to justify his 80%, I don't think he's going to have to look farther than looking at China's market access barriers and China's level of underpricing that is aided and abetted by the Chinese government pulling these levers of the Chinese economy to underprice us. So he's essentially sort of level the playing field. Yeah.
If you see justification for that number, do you have confidence that they actually could walk away from talks in Switzerland tomorrow at a number like that, given your vast experience in dealing with China on trade issues? Are they going to be a willing partner in these conversations here, Nazak? Do you think tangible outcomes are possible in the short term?
Look, I think if the Chinese press the president or Secretary Bessent and Ambassador Greer on the 80%, it's going to be easy for them for the U.S. administration to justify it. But I don't want to. It's impossible to overstate how difficult these negotiations are going to be. The U.S. is looking for the Chinese government to not only open up the markets for U.S. businesses, but really to reform their economy so the U.S. market, doesn't have to deal with these distortions that arise from the Chinese government intervening so much in the economy, including currency manipulation to underprice. But it's going to be very difficult to press for that because the Chinese government needs that to retain its position as the global manufacturer. So what we ask for, the Chinese government may not be able to give. And so the big question for Secretary Bessent and Ambassador Greer is, where do you find compromise? And can you find compromise at all? The Chinese are pretty much going to, I think, stand firm on what their demands are, which are continued access to the U.S. market and technology transfer from the U.S. to China. And those are things that the administration might not be too keen to give.
Well, on your point about the kind of manufacturing overcapacity, the flooding of global markets with Chinese supply, this is not a unique idea to this administration. We heard plenty about this during the Biden administration as well. This is something that the Treasury Secretary then, Janet Yellen, was incredibly focused on. But is the difficulty with that in particular, not just in asking China to make kind of structural changes to the economy, as you described, also that the U.S. can't necessarily force that alone when China has plenty of other buyers who may be willing to take that supply? Is it that the U.S. actually needs other countries to cooperate with this effort? Because when I spoke to the Commerce Secretary, Howard Lutnick, about this yesterday, he kind of pushed back on the idea that they're asking that of other countries to counter China.
That's a great question, and you hit the nail on the head. Look, the dynamic is when China floods the global markets with cheap goods, right? And steel and aluminum, that's kind of when the world started waking up to China's overcapacity. But now we have autos, we have semiconductors, optical fiber cables, the list goes on, right? What happens there is that it collapses global prices. And then producers in other markets can't sell in their markets, can't sell in markets abroad. So then they end up redirecting their product to the United States, which is why the tariffs that the president had imposed on steel and aluminum, in part, just to put the wall around the United States, prevented us from feeling that effect of China's overcapacity. So on one hand, Secretary Bessent is right, and on the other hand, there's a counter argument. One, we just put barriers around ourselves to sort of shield us in the United States from overcapacity, does that kind of take care of the problem? Yes. And we saw that example with steel and aluminum. But at the end of the day, we can't have our allies' markets collapse either by virtue of China's overcapacity, because it's having the same effect on our allies that it it is on the United States. So it's really incumbent on the United States to kind of give them top cover to be able to push back. The thing I want to really emphasize is that when we imposed the steel and aluminum tariffs, many of our allies started getting flooded with cheap Chinese steel and aluminum. So they started erecting safeguards around their borders to shield themselves from China's overcapacity. So I think we're going to get there. It's really incumbent on us to give our allies cover so they could do the same and push back on China.
Well, one ally, the UK, now has a framework, at least trade agreement with the US that does include taking down tariffs on steel and aluminum in particular, as well as kind of other sectoral elements, including this 100,000 auto quota where the tariff rate is only 10%. And I wonder what you make of that framework we learned about yesterday, knowing there's still details that need to be filled in, Nazak, and if you see that as being a kind of reliable blueprint that other countries might look to follow, or just being unique to the UK specifically.
It's an important sort of signaling tool, right? I mean, there's elements of the deal that are really good, increase market access for agriculture in addition to the items you said. Market access, I think the U.S. government is estimating an increase of $5 billion. Still, that the 10% tariffs remain on most goods from the UK. That'll raise $6 billion in tariff revenue from the United States. UK tariffs on the United States drops from 5.1% to 1.8%. That's a big deal. So there's a lot of good there. And I think what the president really wanted to do was quickly get a deal, a big deal that signaled to other countries, look, a deal with the United States is possible. We don't have to continue to be enemies. Peter, who was on just a little bit earlier, Peter Navarro, is right. Our allies in Europe, most of these European countries, if you combine their tariff and non-tariff barrier equivalents and convert it into a tariff rate, it's about 13% on the United States. Before the Trump administration, the tariff rates of the United States were about 1.6% applied tariff. So you see this huge disparity. So I think with Trump, again, the Trump administration is really at least hoping to signal to the markets is, we want to work with our allies again. We want to get to trade deals that open up both of our markets. And if we can do that, if we can integrate our economies with those of our allies, now we have a hope of pushing back against China. And let's be clear, Europe doesn't have to rely on the Chinese market anymore. Integrate your supply chains with the United States. I think this is what Trump's trying to signal. Integrate your supply chains with the United States. Neither of us are going to be dependent on China, and our economies are going to be stronger. I hope the president can execute that strategy, but we'll see what happens in Switzerland.